Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Candidate Psychology 101. My name is Claire Alloway, and I am a part of the marketing team here at Jobvite. I wanted to just go over a couple of administrative details before we get started with Paul's presentation. First off, this is just a quick overview of what you're going to see today. First off, Paul is going to go through how we make decisions, good and bad, discussing the influence triggers that are so hardwired we almost can't say no, and applying these Jedi tricks to get more yes answers and fewer changed minds. Sorry, I'm dealing with some allergies over here. On the housekeeping side of the presentation, first off, you'll notice your lines are muted, and that's just to avoid background noise. But we'll be having questions at the end of the presentation, and you can also use Twitter if you'd like, using the hashtag JVChat, and we'll be monitoring that for questions as well for Paul. We're also going to have a follow-up blog post if we run out of time, so we'll make sure that all of your questions on candidate psych are answered. And here's a very thorough overview of today's presenter. Paul Hebert has a whole host of accolades, being interviewed by the BBC and USA Today, along with being a contributing writer on the Fistful of Talent blog. He's a writer and member of the editorial advisory board at HR Examiner, contributing author to a number of books, social media editor, and the senior director Solutions Architect at Creative Group, Inc. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Paul, who's going to go through a little more detailed of an agenda for today's presentation.
Okay, so I wanted to run through the agenda real quick. Thanks for the introduction, Claire. I really appreciate that. If you didn't hear it, it was wonderful. But the agenda today, I really wanted to do two things. One is I kind of wanted to walk through the fact that recruiters, I think a lot of times are told that they have to be cognizant of the biases they bring to the table when they're recruiting and finding people for jobs. But on the other hand, there's another side of that story, and is that the people that you're talking to about getting these jobs have biases, and they have ways that you can leverage those biases and those influence techniques to get more yes answers for you and to get people to take jobs they should take and help them through that decision-making process. So part of this whole reason for doing this is to give you some tools that you can use that leverage some of the same things that you've been told that you have to be cognizant of, which are all those biases. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of my story, how I kind of figured out that these biases were working on me as a candidate, and then I thought I'd walk through those different biases and elements of influence, and then apply them in specific places in the journey of the candidate. And again, I'm not a recruiter by trade, so I'm kind of pushing these out as, thinking through the process I went through and what I understand of the process most recruiters go through. Obviously, there's going to be other steps in here. It's not this linear all the time, but I think the application is still pretty good. Then we'll do a little sum up, and then I've put some books in here that I think will be good reading material for the future so that you can get a little deeper insight into some of this stuff, because we're going to cover quite a bit pretty quickly here. But I thought I'd start with my story. Anyway, and my story was this, that I lived in Dayton, Ohio. I was 26 years old, first real job. Actually, it was my second job out of college, but it was the one that ended up being my career. And I was doing exceptionally well. I thought I was doing well. My reviews said I was doing well. And then one day I got a call from a recruiter, so I knew they were looking for me. But if you don't know Dayton, if you know anything about Dayton, it's probably the birthplace. You probably know it's the birthplace of aviation. North Carolina wants to claim that. The Wright brothers are actually from Dayton, Ohio. They had a little garage there where they repaired bicycles and where they built the first plane. And the other thing about Dayton, Ohio, as you might know, is it's the home of the Air Force Museum. And for some of the tin hat folks out there, it's also where they took the aliens from Roswell. You've probably heard that as well. But here's the deal. I'm a 25, 26-year-old sitting in Dayton, Ohio, not a big city, and I get a call from a recruiter in Chicago saying, Paul, we noticed you. We saw you out there. Come on up to Chicago. We got a client that wants to talk to you. They and this is new to me, right? So they send me an airline ticket in the mail. And that's when back in the day when they actually had hard copy airline tickets. And I get off the airplane in Chicago, and I come out, and there is a limo waiting for me, my first limo ride ever. So I'm feeling like $1 million. I go and I meet with the folks at the new company, and they're wonderful, and we go through the whole process, and we talk about salary, and I did the old, I was feeling kind of good about myself, and I did the old, telling you how much I earn isn't really important. It's how much you think I'm worth, blah, blah, blah. And then I go back home, and then they call me, and they offered me twice my salary. They doubled my salary that I was making without knowing what I was making, but they offered me twice as much. And so as you can imagine, at 26, 25, 6 years old, I hear that. I take the job because I'm a genius. When somebody offers you twice your salary, you take the job. And I did. My wife quit her job. I went in and resigned. And 2 weeks later, I didn't take the job. I reversed my decision. And everybody now on the phone's going, what? And you're right. It was an amazing discussion that followed that got me to this point. But it was during this discussion that I started looking at what happened and why I ended up saying no to doubling my salary. And it all boiled down to I was dealing with somebody who was a master of the mind, the person that called me to keep me at the company. And I'll tell you, the things that he did, and this was kind of an interesting, as I look back on it, I didn't know it was happening. And that's the funny thing about these decision biases and these influence techniques is that they're kind of hardwired into human beings, and you don't really know they're happening. Even when you're told they're happening, you have a hard time resisting some of them. But what he had done is, first and foremost, we talked about what he did first and foremost is he was the president of the company. And he called me and said, I want to meet with you, Paul. So him bringing his authority into the equation was huge. Anytime there's an authority figure involved, we really have a hard time saying no to people in the position of authority. You've probably heard of the Milgram experiment where they actually asked people to shock people based on getting wrong answers, and they had somebody in a white lab coat telling them that they had to continually turn up the dial and increase the severity of the shocks. And people did. They continued to turn it up, even to the point of actually hearing people scream and yell, and all because somebody in a white lab coat told them to. So having authority as part of the equation made a big difference to me. The president of the company is talking to me. I should listen to this person. Second thing he did was he talked about something called the fear of loss versus of gain. He didn't talk to me so much about doubling my salary because that was a huge gain for me, obviously. He talked more about what would I lose by leaving. And what he talked about there was my friendships with the people I had built over the couple of years. He talked about the respect that he had for me and my work. He talked about my relationships with my managers and the team that I had built and the team that I worked with. So he really positioned a lot of what was going to happen as a loss, not a gain. And so there was an emotional side of me saying, man, I am losing a lot in this deal. And so he went through that very meticulously. And then he also talked to me a little bit about, and the reason that the Dan Moreno picture's up there is he started saying, Paul, you're like Dan Moreno. You're just like him. So he was telling me I'm going to be, I should think like Dan Moreno thinks. And because we're both of that caliber, I should look to Dan and what he did. And he said when he was, started down in Miami, do you think he just went down there by himself and just kind of hung out? No, he made sure that there were, contractual things in there about what they were going to spend on the new offensive line to protect him and things that were going to happen to keep him at peak performance and to keep him employed, basically, which I had none of. It was just basically a fairly low-level job, but I didn't have a big contract associated with it. So he walked me through all of that, and that caused me psychologically to refuse to say, I can't take this offer now. The president of the company is telling me I shouldn't. I'm going to lose all of this stuff. And if Dan Marino is going to ask for that stuff, I surely should. So all of those things combined to make me change. Now, why does our brain do that to us? Well, there's a big reason for that, and that is survival. This works because we have to make decisions to survive. And when we're talking about survival, I'm talking about survival 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, because we haven't evolved that much since that time. So those decisions we make in today's world are using tools that were honed and built over millennia to keep us alive out in the wild, meaning we had to make sure that we stayed away from the tiger. So sometimes the decisions we make don't make sense today, but in the sense of trying to keep ourselves alive, they make all kinds of sense. And you may have read a book recently or read some things around there called this How You Make Decisions out there. And the psychologist came up with a System 1 and System 2, thinking fast and thinking slow. And System 1 is the automatic, fast, unconscious way in which our brain works. And it's a very, very efficient decision engine. But it's prone to a lot of biases and systemic errors. It makes a lot of mistakes. Now, System 2 is a very slow and controlled process. That's the stuff that takes attention and takes us focusing on something, and we can't do that without paying a lot of attention to it. Now, System 1 is our kind of default setting because survival-wise, it's better to be wrong if we think there's a tiger behind the rock and be afraid of that rock and leave. Even if there isn't one there, we're still in the best shape. If we just ignore it and go around the rock and we get eaten by the tiger, bad news. So it's better for us to think quickly and be wrong, evolutionarily speaking, than to think fast and be right. So, or to think slow and be right. So these are the kinds of things that are hardwired. And actually, we've got kind of a quick a poll that I'd like everybody to take. It's going to take we're going to show you a choice, and you've got about 15 seconds to make a decision, and then we'll see how that poll comes out. So I'm going to go ahead and click to the poll, and then you got about 10 or 15 seconds to look at the poll. All right, there's the results. Now looking at that, almost 80% of you would rather choose choice beef that's 90% lean, even though 10% fat is exactly the same thing. So our brains are hardwired to kind of jump to conclusions. And framing is what we call a lot of this. A lot of what we're talking about is framing, and that affects our System 1 thinking. So just doing that quick poll right there shows that even though if we spend enough time, and again, this is where your System 2 comes in, if I concentrate and look at it, and I saw somebody in the comments go, wait a minute, that's the same thing. They actually had enough time to look at that and say, well, wait a minute, neither of those choices is different. But 80% of you choose 90% lean because it sounds better, even though it's exactly the same as 10% fat. So the bottom line in all of this is that, we are not the king of our brain. We think we are. We think we're rational, and we can be, but we have to really exercise a lot of control. And what we're trying to do here is talk about the things that go on in your brain that you can leverage when talking to candidates that are going to be able to help them make decisions. Because truthfully, these are kind of, like I say, they're built in. For some of you youngsters, you won't know what this is, but it's a tape recorder. And the way it works is you press the button, the tape plays. And that's kind of how these decision biases and things work, is we don't even react. We don't even know we're reacting. They press the buttons, they happen, and we just go into automatic mode. So it's going to be a quick discussion as we talk about some of the things that we have a hard time actually fighting off. And some of them, even when you know that that's a possibility, you still end up falling victim to them. So first of all, let's talk about the anchor bias. And I love this one because most people already know about it, but there's some little pieces of it that you don't know. First of all, we tend to rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered, which is considered the anchor, when making decisions. So you've probably heard of going to the car dealership and they show you the most expensive model, the one that you can't afford, because they know as they come down to a lower priced model, by comparison, that anchor is going to make you think this is so much cheaper. Right, so it's one of the examples that they talk about is that they can offer 4 rolls for $2 of paper towels, or 50 cents a roll. Most people will buy 4 rolls for $2 because they're honing in, anchoring on that 4 versus the 50. Believe it or not, it's that hard in our brain. They've actually did and the key here, the thing that I keep trying to explain to people is it's not always about the money. It's not always attached to a money issue, because I think a lot of people will say, okay, well, I'll talk about salary in a certain way, and that becomes the anchor for discussion going forward. But it doesn't have to be in the same realm. In other words, the anchor doesn't have to exist in the same context that the decision's being made in. So even when you're told that there is this process going on and you're told that I'll give you money if you ignore it, it's hard to do. But here's an example of the idea of it doesn't have to be in the same domain. Is they did an experiment where they asked people to write down the last two digits of their Social Security number. And they kind of split it in the middle, like at 50, so that people below 50 were considered low, people above 50 were considered high. So in other words, if the last two digits of your Social Security number were 11, you were at the low end. If there were 88, you were at the high end. And they said put a dollar sign in front of that. So they had people put a dollar sign in front of the 11 and the 88. Then they had those same two groups bid on wine. And the people that had put 11 down versus the people that put 88 down. The people that put 88 down bid 346% higher for the same wine, simply because they were anchored at a much lower number. So when we're talking to people, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but this anchoring can really affect the way people see the numbers you're presenting to them. So I've got another poll here. And I'm going to ask you to take a look at this and ask the question, would you drive 20 minutes to save $20 on a $100 blouse? So answer the question. We'll give everybody about 15, 20 seconds to do that. So 20% discount, basically. $20 on a $100 blouse. Okay, that's probably enough time for people to do that. So if you look at that, we're at about 60-40 or 58-41, right? So most people are saying no, they wouldn't drive that far. Now that's kind of an interesting result, because that's not normal. So you're kind of screwing with my polls here, people, because now I'm going to ask the same question, but a little bit differently. Is would you drive 20 minutes to save $20 on a $10,000 car? So now go ahead and answer this one and see how many of you would drive 20 minutes to save $20,000 on a $10,000 car. And I can see where this is going pretty much already as you look at the numbers that are kind of coming in. So we could probably go ahead and go to the results now. But if you look at this, we have a much different skew. Actually, I'm surprised that the first part didn't skew differently. So here we are. We're at 92% said that they would not drive 20 minutes to save $20,000 on a $10,000. Now, let me ask this question to those people that now switched their vote, because there was 51% said that 40% would drive 20 minutes to save $20 on a blouse. Why is that $20 different than this $20? It has the same exact value. The only difference between those pieces of information is one's compared to $100 and one's compared to $10,000. So again, our brain is anchoring in on something that's kind of irrelevant to the decision, because $20 is $20, whether I drive 20 minutes or not. It's the same amount of money. So that's why when we start thinking about, when we're talking about this, that we have to understand how these anchoring things actually make us choose things we didn't expect to choose. Our brain's just not that good. The other thing we do a lot of is something called loss aversion. And this is very important, because so often in our lives, we try to talk to people about how much they're going to gain, when the reality is people are more afraid of losing things. Remember my story. I was more afraid of losing my friendships and my connections than I was of gaining the dollar amounts. And it's actually, it's really weird, because, again, back to the same amount. They do these tests with loss aversion when it comes to gambling. But they told one group that I would give a group, they gave two groups $50. One group, they said you could keep 30 or gamble for win-loss for 50. So you would either lose all the 50 or keep 30. And 43% of the people gambled. Then they said the same thing to another group, but they changed it a little bit, and they said you can either lose 20, in other words, give me $20 back, or gamble to lose 50 or gain 50. And 61% of the people gambled because they didn't want to lose $20. They actually saw gambling to get $50 as a better deal than keeping $30. It's the same $30. All in one case we said lose, in the other case we said keep. So people are just really driven by this idea that I'm losing something, and that's real important because our brains are just wired that way from a survival standpoint. It's better for me to keep the stuff I have than to try to go out and forage for something I don't have yet. So keep in the back of our minds that people gaining something is not always the best way to position things. The other thing that people go through is this whole process. And I only got about 3 more of these, and then we're going to talk about applications, so hang with me here, folks. There's something called the endowment effect and the pseudo endowment effect, and it's a reason I put both of those up there. But they've done experiments with you think you own something, it's worth more to you. They've done studies where they ask people, how much do you think this coffee cup is? And they would say $2. Then they would give the coffee cup to people and say, how much would you sell it for? And they would say $4. That coffee cup went up 100% in just that little time where we actually gave it to them. So owning something drives the value up. And it doesn't have to be real ownership. It can just be pretend ownership. That's why auctions work, because the minute you're the high bidder in an auction, you see yourself as owning that item. And then when somebody outbids you, it's kind of like they took it away from you. And you don't like that. So you're going to go and bid again to make sure you get it back, because and as the bids go up, it gets more valuable. So this idea of owning something versus not owning something can come into play when we're talking to candidates, and I'll show you how in just a minute. But this idea, we have to understand that somehow we've got to make people feel like they've already got the job. One of the last two here is confirmation bias. This election, if it didn't teach you anything, it did teach you confirmation bias is alive and well. And the one I like a lot is that, when you talk to people about confirmation bias, they always come up with this idea that my children never do anything wrong because they never see it. They can point to 100 things their kids do great, and they never see the things that their children do wrong. People who believe in ESP can always remember the time that they were thinking about their mother or their father and the phone rang and that was them on the phone, but they never seem to understand that they probably thought about their mother or father a million other times where the phone didn't ring, but that doesn't confirm the fact that they believe in ESP. So understanding how the confirmation bias works in our minds can help you with the way you manage your recruits. And finally, the second to last one is called commitment and consistency. And this is a really strong way to influence somebody's behavior. When we give somebody when we tell somebody we're going to do something, we want to stay committed to that. They did an experiment on a beach where they set up a towel with a bunch of stuff on it, like a cooler and a radio, and they set it down next to another family, and then they left. And while they were gone, they had another group of people that were in on the study come up and steal the stuff. And that was the first setup. And then the second setup, they did the same thing, except before they left, they leaned over to the people that were sitting there and they said, would you watch our stuff for us? The differences in the responses were remarkable. When they didn't ask for their help, only 20% of the people stopped them from stealing their stuff. When they did ask, 95% did. So just simply asking for some commitment can make a big difference on whether somebody will actually follow through on something. And this last one I want to talk about before we get into examples is really interesting because nobody believes it, but it's a fact. And that is the use of the word because. Now what you're looking at there's a copier. Again, some of the youngsters wouldn't know what that is because they've got printers now. But they did an experiment where they had a big line of people working at a print to make copies, and they cut in line, and they were trying to give reasons why they should be able to cut in line, and they were seeing how many people would actually take them up on the offer. So the first case was, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush? And when they did that, used that, 94 of the people let them cut in line. They then did it and said, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine? And only 60% of the people would let them cut in line. So they started thinking, well, why was that? Why did that happen? So they changed the wording, and this is the wording they used. They said, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I have to make some copies? Now, if you think about that sentence, it has anything after may I use the Xerox machine adds 0 value. Because I have to make copies is a given. It's obvious. It doesn't add any additional information. But the word because made it go back up to 93%. So just simply saying because I need to make copies changed the way people responded. And this, they think, goes back to the days that when we were young and we asked permission and everything, or we asked for something, we were told because this and why this, because we're looking for the word because that gives us a reason. And then that reason is why we hang on to that. So using the word because. So I say all of this because these and understanding these ideas on how the human mind works can help you increase the odds that people will say yes to your request. And it helps you understand and ups the chances that you're going to have people end up on the positions that you're giving them. Now, there's no guarantees. That's why I always put this slide in there, because there's always somebody that comes back and says, well, Paul, I tried that and it didn't work. And that's true. In all of these cases, all it does is increase your odds. There are no guarantees. This is not really Jedi mind control. So let's talk about the way in which we can leverage these in the world that we live in when we're doing recruiting. So first of all, I kind of broke this down to the initial contact, right? So I'm calling somebody. I'm trying to connect with a new recruit and try to get them involved. What would I do, knowing these tools exist? Well, first and foremost, I would probably set an anchor early, an anchor that's either low or high, depending on what I think is going to happen at the thing. So if I know that this job is going to pay, $50,000, and I might set an anchor below that at 30 in some way, shape, or form, saying things like, this client has jobs, they've got a bunch of them at 30, but they've got a couple at 50, blah, 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 so that now you are setting, when you come back with your offer, you've got them set at maybe, so when you come in at 46, that sounds a lot better than 30. It sounds like they really got something out of it. So the idea of setting some anchors early, and again, it doesn't have to be just in the salary range. It can be in a lot of different, whatever numbers you're trying to get them to like, you find a way to set an anchor so that your number looks good. And again, salary is the easy place to do it in this space because you can always talk about ranges and things like that. But knowing that the ranges you use are going to be used in their brain when they're comparing the actual offer you get. So anchoring would be number one. Number two is asking for small commitments. And this is key because at the very beginning you can say things to them like, are you willing to take a look at something? Are you willing to at least read this document? Are you willing to go to the website and tell me what you think of the employee benefits that they've listed? In other words, you're asking them to take an action in the direction of that offer or that company. So they are now building these little tiny commitments for you. So when you start to ask bigger things like, will you get on the phone? Will you accept this? They're kind of in the mode. They now want to try to stay consistent with their past behavior, and so they're going to be starting to look for ways to fulfill your request. So getting small requests out there that move them in the direction creates minor commitments for them. And then finally, the loss aversion thing is start getting them to visualize themselves in the job. Talk to them about the desk that they might sit at, or the place that they're going to work, or the parking lot, or the view out the window, because these are going to be things now that they're going to put in their brain, and it's going to make them feel like they're already there. So that sets the stage for when you make the offer and they start to talk about it and maybe pull back, they're actually losing the job. They saw themselves in this position. So that's when I'm setting up the deal if I'm doing the initial contact, these are three ways I would be taking some of these influence techniques and moving myself to say, okay, I'm going to establish my anchor. I'm going to look for commitments. I'm going to try to establish that pseudo endowment, that they see themselves in the job, that they're kind of owning this. So on the initial contact stage, that's what I would be looking at. Then once we get to the point where I know there's a lot of steps in the middle here, so I'm not trying to make this look too compressed, but positioning the offer, this is another major process, right, a major step, and I'm sure this is where a lot of problems arise. So I'm thinking, okay, how would I handle this? Well, first of all, I would reference the anchor, or I would reference relative to the anchor that we started with. So I would try to make sure I brought that into the equation, because that's going to make them say, oh, yeah, that's right, that is a lot more than what they were talking about. I would reference the commitments they've already made. You've looked at the website, you've read it, just kind of reminding them that they've been moving in this direction all along. And then I would also look for confirmation bias. I would be using words that they had been using all along. So if they talked about needing a place that was open and welcoming, I would probably use similar words in the offer that, instead of onboarding, maybe I'd use the word welcoming, so that I'm trying to now connect with what I've heard over the course of our conversation that I can now confirm back to them, because they're going to think, well, that's just like I think. So that's a good place to work. And then finally, I think I might layer in a little bit more of the loss aversion. So again, what are they going to lose? We talked about your office. We talked about the shorter commute. You're not going to get that if you don't take this offer. So look in terms of things that they might lose. Again, I know that's a real contrary thing, because we always talk about wanting to talk to people about how do you get to positioning the gain. Think about how you can position the loss, because we've established up front, we've done the pseudo endowment step at the beginning. So that's one way for positioning the offer that can be helpful. Now, closing the deal, and again, that's, we call it what we want, but I mean getting them to actually make the commitment now. So first and foremost, what I would do is, like I did at the very beginning of this discussion, is simplify the deal. Make it a System 1 decision and remove as much complexity as possible. And that comes from framing. So if you can find a way to sum up the offer, the deal, the job, the benefit they get in a very simple, packaged way, that's going to kick in their Decision 1, their System 1 decision-making, and keep them from necessarily going through, because I know you've had candidates that they get lost in the minutia of it, and they're trying to make a decision, and they can't, and it's because they're not in System 1 anymore. They're really too deep in System 2, and they just don't know where to go. So keep it simple. That'd be the first thing I do, is kind of make it as simple as possible, see if I can leverage System 1 thinking. Then I would, again, hit that commitment button hard. Remind them of the things they told you all along in the process. You said you wanted. Get them to agree that the things you said. Car salesmen are great. If you ever want some, and I wouldn't suggest that you do it as blatantly and as obviously, but if you think about it, a lot of these techniques, they get you to say, oh, you wanted the third row seat. This has a third row seat. You wanted this. This has this. So they're doing similar things. They're just not as good at doing it. You can be better. And then finally, I would use the word because, and we forget to do this so often. And it's so simple to just say, and you should take this job because, fill in the blank almost. And again, that's just going to up your odds. I'm not saying that this is some magic word that all of a sudden their eyes are going to start spinning and they're going to say yes. But it does influence their behavior. It does up the chances that they're going to go along with it. So that's closing the deal. Now, I did think that there was also the possibility, just like in my case, where somebody takes the deal and then wants to back out. And I'm sure you've run into this. So how do you recover after you've got somebody in there and they want to come back? Well, this is, again, I would jump all over the commitment, consistency, and the endowments. Those are the two big ones that I think are going to drive home how they are going to respond once you come back to them. Think about my experience. They told me, what they were, all the stuff that I had done for the company. The president came in. I'm going to, I already own this position. Now this guy already owns, this person already owns the job. And then finally the whole loss aversion thing. And so there are a lot of other of influencers and decision things that go into this, but I thought I'd take the biggest ones, and those are that. But here's the key in all of this stuff we've talked about. The biggest thing in all of this is you have to be intentional with this. I don't know how many times I have meetings with clients and we go through how to influence behavior, how to help their managers influence behavior in the organization, and then when they come back and they say, well, Paul, that didn't work as well as we thought, and then I ask them, well, what did you do? How did it work? Well, we didn't really, they didn't apply any of it. I tell people when I sit down, I have at my desk at my office, I have a list of all of these biases. I have a list of the influence techniques. And when I'm talking to people, especially when I'm in sales mode, I'm checking them off next to me. Did I mention commitment? Did I figure out how to establish loss aversion? Is there an endowment here that I haven't leveraged? So it's got to be intentional or it's not worth it. But these things are all ways that you can up the chances that you're actually going to get somebody to say yes more often. And they're not duplicitous. You're just understanding the machine of the human mind, the owner's manual, so to speak. So I'm rushing a little bit because I know we got a later start than normal. But to summarize up everything we've just talked about, is number one is we are not rational. The people you're dealing with are not rational. I'm not rational. Amber Weisbaum's not rational. Abel Roston's not rational. Anybody else on this list, sorry, you're not rational. We all end up being a little bit wacky. And we can take advantage of that to a certain degree by understanding how we're wacky. And that the decisions are made based on how we interact with the situation. So what's presented to us is how we decide, and we decide at a much higher level than at a different level than we think. So we need to control that situation. We, meaning the recruiter, can organize the process to know which levers to spin and which knobs to pull. So the idea being is you can walk in knowing when to include anchoring, contrast, loss aversion, confirmation bias, because you control that process. So you can then hopefully have some control over how the decision-making process will actually go, and hopefully in your favor more often. And finally, you need to make this intentional. Without the intentionality, it's just once in a while you're shooting from the hip, and it might happen, it might not, and you can't on a long-term basis make a big difference. So really pushing hard on the intentional part of this. And then finally, I wanted to kind of just throw up 3 or 4 different books that I think you should at least read. At a minimum, these books they're my Bibles for a lot of things, especially influence. I touched on 3 or 4 of the 6 influence techniques that are in there. Switch is great because it talks about the emotional and rational part of decision making. Made to Stick I like because it's a way of getting ideas set out there. And then Change or Die is really good because it shows how hard it is to get somebody to change behavior. So that is kind of the whole presentation. So I wanted to say thank you again and just appreciate you putting up with the problems we had at the beginning. And if you have some questions, I think we have a few minutes here that we can cover some stuff if you have questions. Love that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Paul. And just to reiterate, thank you everyone for sticking with us. Hopefully the presentation was worth your time, and I know a couple of questions are going to come in about this. Slides and the recording will be sent out. As you may have noticed, Paul keeps his slides pretty light on words, so we'll definitely send out the recording so you can listen again and send it out to all of your coworkers so they can start using these as well. And we're getting a couple of questions, so I'm going to go through some of them. So Matt had a question. Can you explain the endowment concept again real quick?
Sure. The idea of the endowment is that when I own something, it's more valuable to me than if I don't. And it's the idea that if I have a mug at my house and I bought it, I put a value on that when I bought it, so it's important to me, so it's mine. Your mug is not as valuable as my mug. So I only would pay you maybe $2 for your mug, but I'm going to want $4 for mine. And it's just the idea that in our brains, something that we own just has more value because it's ours. And if I can get people to see themselves in that job, now they think they own the job. They're part of that. So having that endowment, or it's called pseudo endowment because you really don't own it, but the idea being is in our brains we kind of mix those things up. And like I said with the auctions, just because I'm number one in the auction, I haven't owned it yet, but I feel like I do. But our brain just sees things differently when we own them. They're more valuable to us. So the more I can do to make a candidate feel like they're already part of the organization, they're going to put more value on that. So I just need to get them to really want to be part of that organization and start thinking in terms of that, because that also establishes that if they don't take the job, I'm taking something away from them.
That makes sense. If you've ever thought you got a great deal on a car or a job or any big ticket item and then it's been taken away, or you've seen a customer who thinks they got a great deal and seen it taken away, that is something you don't want to get in the way of. Definitely, people get a lot angrier when they think something they own is not theirs anymore. Okay, so a ton of people are asking about those lists of recommended books, so I'm going to move back to that slide, and as it is in the deck, we'll be sending that out as well, but you can take a look here at those covers. Okay, let's see. It looks like...
Seems like a lot of people really want to know why I turned down the job.
That's the common question.
Well, I mean, here's the net of it, because it actually caused quite a bit of problem in my life after the fact. But I'm glad I did. I wouldn't be where I am, and my wife and I wouldn't be where we are in our lives if we had stayed there. It turned out that the president of the company was right to tell me not to take the job. Within 2 years, the company I was with actually bought the company that had offered me the job and had laid everybody off. So I would have been without a job in 2 years, which is exactly, now maybe he knew that, I don't know, because he would have been probably part of the deal, putting the deal together. But the real reason I didn't take the job was when he started explaining to me that if you truly are a high performer they want to keep for the long run, they will make sure that they have good people working for you, that they give you a contract that has some sort of longevity clause in it, and they weren't doing any of that. So then it was basically, well, Paul, why do you think they are giving you such a big raise? It sounds to me like they're desperate. And it really did kind of come across that way. So ultimately the reason is I was afraid that he was right. I knew what I had was good, and it was really good. And I stayed, and it worked out fine. But it was really the fear of losing what I had. So the loss aversion part was big.
Very interesting. We had one question from Brittany come in. She says, I like the ideas of anchors. How could you leverage this when you're working with standard employment contracts?
I'm not sure how the standard employment contracts is. Contracts typically, most of the things I was referencing here are things you would bring up in conversation potentially or in email communication, not necessarily contractually. But, I mean, if I had to really think it through, if I was, and these are just some weird numbers, if I was talking to somebody about a job, I would probably, and if I had to put a number, like a salary number in the contract, I might have a sentence or a paragraph in that write-up that says typically this job ranges between X and Y, and I would probably have their salary closer to the high end versus the low end so that they would think, wow, I'm getting a lot more than maybe the lowest end. And you'd have to talk about and I don't know exactly the situation because every contract's a little different. Or if you could find a way to get other numbers in there that are much higher than or lower than what you're talking about, because that'll anchor them mentally lower. I'm not sure exactly the question, so I'm having a little difficult time answering it. I apologize, but it's just the idea of trying to establish something, and again, I think it's more in the conversation standpoint that you can talk about ranges, you can talk about the industry paying X, so that when your offer comes on the table, they're anchored to a much lower number, so they think your offer looks that much better. I mean, if you tell everybody in the conversation that, oh, the industry on average pays $30,000, and then they get an offer for $50,000, they're going to think, wow, that's better than the average by a lot. So those happen during the conversations. I know that's not a great answer, and I apologize.
Hopefully it answered part of the question, or the heart of the question. So Esmeralda had a question. How do you manage the relocation part of recruiting? And maybe this came into play with your job offer, but
yeah.
How did you manage it in playing with the loss aversion or homesickness and all of that?
Yeah, and that's this is where I think some of this can come into play, especially the commitment side of things, is you get them to start moving in that direction slowly. Get them to, give them websites of areas of the town that they're moving to that's similar to where they are right now. See if you can do any kind of LinkedIn connections to see if they know people in the area so that you can connect them to that, and ask them to go and look at here's some apartments you might be interested in. So anything you can get them to start moving in that direction will help. It starts to pull them away from that. There's some people that are just, that are never going to leave home. But relocation, to me, that's where, and I've been through this myself, where they bring you in for a weekend, they put you up at a nice place, they have you hang out, get to know the neighborhoods, that kind of thing. In one job, we had mentors that would work with us over a whole weekend. They'd hang out with us, take us out to dinner, make sure we saw the sites, found out what. So that anything you can do to make them feel like if they moved there, they already had a friend. They already had a network, because that's really what you're asking. You're asking somebody to give up their network. And if I can establish that there is a network there of some sort, either electronically or in real life, that's one way I would do that, is try to move that toward, use that commitment part of that to move them that way, and then they start to get them to see themselves living there, because then going back home is actually leaving someplace that they like.
That makes sense. I think we have time for maybe one last question.
Sure.
Let me scroll through. You guys are a very vocal audience, which I absolutely love. Let's see. Jane just asked, could you go a little bit more into detail about social proof?
Yeah, social proof. I didn't bring that up too heavily here, but social proof is a big one. It's what makes most of us do a lot of what we do every day, and it's the old story that if Timmy jumped off the bridge with you, well, chances are you would. I do a presentation around influence techniques, and one of the slides I use is that a 5-year-old knows more of these tools than we do in our business world, because every 5-year-old in the world knows how to say, but Mommy, Timmy's mom lets him do it. That's a kid leveraging social proof. The idea is that when given an opportunity to be an individual, we will look to see what everybody else is doing. And that's just a fact. There's actually an experiment they did called the Asher test, where they take a person and put them in a group of people that are in on the experiment, and they show three lines on a piece of paper, and they say, which of these 3 lines is the exact same length as this 4th line? And everybody in the room agrees, except for the person that's actually being tested, that one of these lines that is obviously not the same length is the right answer. And in 75% of the cases, the person will agree with the team, even though it is painfully obvious it may be half the length. But when given that test without the group around them, 99% of the people do it right. So the only difference is that I just want to go along. It's just something that when we hear that people like us are doing this, how do you get Snapchat? How do you get Twitter? It's because somebody says everybody's doing it. We wouldn't have the me generation, right? But yeah, social proof is a very powerful one. It's leveraged all the time, especially if you're talking to somebody from a recruiting standpoint. It would be people with your credentials typically want to gravitate to these kind of jobs because that gets them ahead. People like you, those are the words that get social proof engaged.
Fantastic. Well, I want to stop a little bit early because I'm sure some of you have some calls at, whatever time it is in 3 minutes in your time zone. But I wanted to thank you all for joining us. Obviously, thank you very much to Paul for putting together this great presentation. And we'll mention it one more time. Thank you very much for dealing with the technical difficulties. I hope everyone had a great day, and we'll have a great week. Thanks, everyone.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you.